So we shall start. So what do we know? So looking at culture change. So this lecture will be specifically looking at the chapter 2 in the core concepts of anthropology. Next class on Wednesday, I will be looking at the readings from the other textbooks, so looking at the concrete examples. So what is anthropology? And if someone can close the door, I guess, to the outside, it comes down to, is it a science? And if we look at how do we usually understand a science? How do we understand what chemistry is? Empirical methods and ways of understanding. So how does chemistry help us understand the world around us? It has to be predictable. So if I throw in some sodium along with some chloride, what will be the outcome? If I combine the two chemically into a new molecule, what will I end up with? Salt. Exactly, I'll end up with salt. So the idea with the science, it's empirical. You come up with hypotheses. You can predict, saying, if I mix these two chemicals together, I will get this outcome. And the same thing with physics, explaining why things do what they do. Why does that ball fall if you drop it? Why does it not fly out into space? So thus you are trying to find ways of coming to a better understanding of the world, but with the expectation that there are laws, there are things that are constant, that are never unending, never changing. So thus, I know that I can't know the laws of thermodynamics. I cannot create energy. I can only transform energy, and this will be done through, with the loss of this energy transformation, there will be heat that will be lost in the process. So thus, if I'm running down the car, changing chemical energy to another form of energy, which is motion, what I end up as a byproduct with an internal combustion energy is heat. So therefore, it is fulfilling, it is still working according to the laws of thermodynamics. Give me a second, I'll try to figure out how to stop this constant beeping from my computer. But what is the challenge of trying to look at culture solely from an empirical and a scientific method? Yep.
It's not always predictable.
It's not always predictable, because what is the challenge when dealing with humans? Not predictable, but also what do we have that atom of chlorine and that atom of sodium do not have? Emotions and thinking. We have the ability to presumably, hopefully, maybe sometimes change our, to change our actions, to interpret our actions, to come up with different strategies, different behaviors. So in other words, we don't follow a clockwork, clock-like function where say if A happens, B is always invariably the context. What is the best that we can do?
Look for general patterns.
Exactly. So it was saying the culture is pattern. We can say, I would expect if this happens, then this would be the normal outcome. It doesn't mean that it will always happen, but at the very least, this is something that is under most circumstances is most likely to happen. So it's not wholly empirical, but it does have the possibility at least to have at best a good guess. However, we see in a sense that even then it's still shaped by other ways of thinking. So that's last class, I didn't really get much of a chance to talk about Foucault, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, aka associated with postmodernism and post-structuralism. And I'll give you in a nutshell what these actually refer to. So let's start with Michel Foucault. Have you encountered the ideas of Michel Foucault in any other classes that you have taken?
What's his idea?
Okay. So Michel Foucault ultimately comes down to this. So very often we associate, with postmodernism, the idea of what is reality. And I'll give you an example of Michel Foucault, who's himself, he characterized as his work as being almost cultural archaeology, is looking at these artifacts from the past in order to create this new understanding of human behavior. So one of the key things he put forward that was adopted, was quite popular in anthropology over, I guess, these last couple of decades, was the concept of the panopticon. And have you ever encountered this concept of the panopticon? Yeah. So what is the panopticon?
It's a self-contained prison system. The idea is that you have a ring of cells around a room with a bottom tower in the middle that is capable of observing all of the cells. Key to this experiment is that the prisoners cannot see into this tower, only the tower can see into the prison cells. So they have to operate under the assumption that they are always being watched, and they can never tell whether or not that is true.
Exactly. And was this prison ever built? No, it was simply he found in the plan somewhere an architect saying, here is how we can build this prison. And you're right, in a sense it is a tower in the middle with presumably the guard or someone else overseeing can watch into all of the cells, but you never know, are you being watched? Are you under surveillance at that particular time? And consequently, what this means is that you have to always ask the question, is it worth the risk of me doing something that might cause me grievous consequences if I do it? So how can we tie this, let's say, to our lives in the 21st century? Yeah? Exactly. There's no such thing as privacy. So everything, once it's on the web, it's on the web forever, and there might be consequence. So it's always the question is, will I be caught? And it's all because there is the expectation that some points, regardless, at some point, something what I do may be found. Then it comes down to almost the statistical. What are the odds I will get caught? What happens if I get caught? And if I say the odds are pretty good that I might get caught and the consequences are quite bad, what am I likely to do? Not exactly, so self-disciplined. In other words, you train the individual to discipline themselves in order to conform. So therefore, it's not necessary to have that police officer or that agent standing over you all the time, walking around with armed and ready to shoot anybody who doesn't follow the law. Rather it is individuals are training themselves to discipline themselves in order, because of this idea of the panopticon. So thus we see Michel Foucault putting forward this archaeology, saying, yeah, this was a cool idea of the panopticon and how it could apply to things such as the factory. So how do you discipline people in the factory? How do we use clocks and time to discipline people, saying there's a set routine. At 12 I have my lunch break. At 4:30 I finish my job. I must be there at 8:30. I know I must get these things done. So in other words, you force yourself to conform to these timelines, to these set standards, and you organize your life around it because of it. This applied to other means as well. The idea, looking at simple question, in the past there were a lot of individuals suffering with leprosy. And prior to modern medicine, what was the only true way you dealt with leprosy, let's say in the medieval ages, in the medieval period? Yep, so that's true. Because what is leprosy? From a medical perspective. It's simply you lose, I guess your nerves lose the ability to react, to have these sensations. So if I put my hand on a boiling pot, what will be the reaction? What will the nerves tell me?
It's hot and it burns.
Exactly, and what will be my reaction? You pull away. So therefore, if the nerves in my fingertips no longer are capable of reacting to pain, what am I likely to do? Not react. What happens if I have my fingers on a burning pot and I'm not pulling it away?
Your hands will melt.
Exactly, your hands will burn. So this is over the period, in a sense, over time, you'll have the physical consequences of the disease will cause you harm to your body as your nerves are no longer able to react to these stimuli. And what was the only treatment? We know that it could be transmitted from one individual to the next. We didn't know how it was transmitted, and there was no cure. So therefore, in order to avoid this, what do? Exactly, you take them out. You send them to these sanatoriums, to the hospitals far away. And this means that they can live out their lives there. They at least will have some kind of care, but we'll try to make sure that it's not transmitted to anybody else. And do we still have leprosy to this day? Exactly. So it's still in existence. And there was, and this is probably before your time, there was that time when the Simpsons, when they went to the leprosy facility in Hawaii, because when the Simpsons thought they had leprosy. So it is something that still exists, but it is not nowhere near as prevalent as it was in the 1500s and the 1600s. And as the leprosy rates went down, what do you end up with? Lots of these institutions that were built to house those with leprosy that are now empty. And how do you recycle all these empty facilities?
Take them work as hotels.
Not quite hotels, but now all of a sudden you have the asylums. You have the asylums in a sense where all of a sudden when you start to medicalize the ideas of what is the sane versus the not sane. Also prisons, because if you look at the past, there are two types of crimes for the most part. There was the crimes that you could get killed for, the capital crimes, and then there were the crimes where you might have to pay a fine or you might have certain consequences, but the idea of sending somebody to a jail was quite rare. You only sent to the tower people that tended to be part of the nobility, of the royal line, that they were sent there in order trying to decide, do we chop off their heads or not? Because what was the problem of letting these certain nobles walk around in society? What did the monarchs fear?
The leper can touch them.
But these were not in the Tower of England. So it's not the leper colony, but those people that you put in, I guess, in the tower, imprisoned in the tower. Because what did the monarch fear? That you had a pretender to the monarch, especially a relative who would say, no, Charles is not the real king. I'm the king, so therefore I will rally the nobles around me in order to ensure that I can seize my rightful power and become the true monarch. So thus, under those circumstances, Charles might decide to put his brother, half-brother, whomever it may be, in the tower in London under guard to make sure that he can't do it, and eventually might simply decide it's easier to behead him than to have this potential competition. So thus, for the normal people, for the people who were of the peasantry, you didn't really have jails per se. So either it was serious enough for you to get killed, or it wasn't. There wasn't this place where you sent people for a set amount of time. So thus, Foucault was trying to look at the idea of the medicalization of things such as mental health, looking at the change where all of a sudden you have the emergence of the prison system. So doing the archaeology and seeing how these things change. So that's in a nutshell what Foucault is. Often people use the word social construction, but the issue that I have with social construction is what do we actually mean by social construction? And invariably, what we mean is that something has a history, that something was there, and it was, I guess, the product of certain processes in the past. So thus, the jail might be a social construction, but it doesn't mean that I can imagine it away. So sometimes with extreme social constructivist ideas, it's almost the idea, if we understand that it's a social construction, poof, it'll magically disappear on its own. But generally, no, it's a power structure. It is the jails maybe have a historical product that weren't always there, but the jail guards will make sure that you stay in jail if you are there, and the bullets will be real enough if you try to escape most of the time. So that's one end, looking at how, I guess, this changed with Foucault. Jacques Derrida was building upon classical linguistics. And we'll be talking about this when it comes to structuralism. The idea of the binary opposites, and very often how we understand meaning. So if I were to say, what is a dog? How do we understand what a dog is? Exactly. What we see, so a four-legged animal that barks, sometimes pees on the carpet and goes bow wow, or however we want to express it. So this is that you have two things. One, you have the signifier, the word that expresses the idea of what a dog is, and there is the signified, that actual physical being, the four-legged animal that is the dog. So the idea with traditional linguistics was how to make the connection between the signifier and the signified to perfect the relationship. So thus, you don't have any potential confusion. So what Derrida says, no, we have to cut this presumed link between signifier and signified. And signifiers don't point towards a real thing. They point to other signifiers. A dog is a dog because it's not a wolf, it's not a fox, it's not a cat. And we create it in opposition to these other things. And a cat is not a cat because it's not a lion. A cat is a cat because it's not a lion, it's not a fig tree, etc. So with Derrida, instead of saying there's this concrete reality, they're trying to get the words to fully express them, we simply have these endless chains of signifiers, these words, these ideas that point to other words, other ideas endlessly, where we have to understand this process where all of a sudden the physical, the material is being created by the ways these signifiers are creating this reality for us. This is what we mean when we say the post-structuralism, that the disconnect between a reality, whatever that reality may be, and this whole chain of signification using words, ideas, and other things in order to try to describe something and fit ourselves into this reality. But if we want to understand this, we have to look at the changes that are occurring in this theory. So starting from the 9th century onwards to the present. So what are the ways that we try to understand how peoples and cultures and societies changed over time? So you have E.B. Tylor, that presented perhaps one of the early definitions of what culture is, presents the idea, French culture as pattern, which we mentioned, orderly, and law-like. So in this sense of law-like, it's like it is more understand in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, things that are known to be true, that they are absolutely true and they can never change. So in other words, Tylor says we have to understand the ways in which we are beholden to certain laws that would affect all cultures, that would be universal, and this is the way that we can understand culture and society scientifically. So trying to come up with a means of doing this. And one of the ways which we'll see this will be this evolutionary thought. The ways in which we will start using the ideas of Charles Darwin to understand how culture changes over time and the forces that push this change over time. And we see this beginning emerging into the thought of multiple different scholars. A case in point, so whereas E.B. Tylor looks at very much saying the change in predictable step-like patterns, will come up with these steps of all the way from the savage to the civilized, and this will be developed by other scholars as well. But let's begin first with the works of Émile Durkheim, perhaps one of the individuals that is essential to the social sciences. So Durkheim believed that culture, and this would include language, customs, rituals, etc., were the product of tangible material causes rather than intangible, metaphysical, or spiritual ones. Now, how can we understand this? What would, prior to the 19th century, what are some of the ways in which intangible spiritual forces were used to explain reality? How about differences in languages? How would, in the medieval period, how did we explain all these different languages spoken around the world? Exactly. And what is the story behind the Tower? I'm not sure whether it's Babel or Babel, but what's the story behind it?
I don't know how good my understanding is, but basically people were trying to build this tower up to heaven or something like that, and then, I don't know, I feel like someone else should explain this.
Pretty close, yes.
Yeah, so people were in fact trying to build the tower up to heaven, and then God, punishing them for their hubris, gave them language, so everybody started speaking different languages. So they could not communicate and collaborate in building this tower. That's an argument for language from a historical point of view.
Exactly. The idea was the human hubris was punished by God, Yahweh, and thus they were spread out over the land, speaking these different languages, leading to these differences between individuals. So therefore, this would be the way that you would explain how languages came to being. Explain, in the case of Western European thought, looking at biblical texts to try to understand social processes. So you would look at, to this day, Noah, looking at Noah as how you explain life on, how life on earth has changed or not changed, and the ways in which societies have changed over time. Whereas in the 19th century, we start having this pushback against this very religious-based understanding of the world. A case in point, in the medieval period, up until, let's say, the 19th century, how old did Western thinkers think that the world was? What was the age that was put forward as this is the correct age of our planet? Yes?
I think Romans or Greeks.
Roman Greece. But let's say in biblical thought, what was in biblical thought, Western Christianity, how old was the earth supposed to be?
They believed in 6,000 years.
6,000, give or take, 6,600. And how did they come up with this timeline?
They looked at the genealogy.
Exactly. They looked at the genealogy. They looked at the Old Testament. They looked at, okay, we have this list of the people from Adam and Eve all the way down, to the Roman period. Thus, we do the calculation. We figure out how many years in a generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, we come up with this age of 6,600 and some odd years. So between 6,000 and 7,000 years. So thus, what will be the challenge if I'm a geologist, if I'm putting forward the idea that the Earth is only 6,000 some odd years old? What? We have stuff older than that. And how do we know that stuff is older than that?
Radiocarbon dating.
Okay, we weren't quite there yet. But let's say, from those 19th century geologists, what were you observing? What are you looking for?
The layers in the earth.
Okay, and how are layers formed? What? Exactly. Rivers, what do rivers do? They cut out channels. Cut out channels. They'll bring the earth, the dirt, the muck that they're carrying. Eventually it'll be deposited where? In the deltas of the rivers. Eventually, over years, you'll have this accumulation. Eventually, sometimes this will actually create rock-like materials. You have the volcanoes, et cetera, et cetera. So what the geologists were doing is say, wait a minute, how can the Earth be 6,000 years old when we see the processes that build up mountains, that break down mountains, that create these layers of silt, these layers of earth, and eventually these layers of rock? It's impossible that the Earth is only 6,000 and some years old. It might be millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of years old. So that was the first crack in this, very much this theological, edifice. And of course, there was pushback because there was the idea of how could this be? Also, now all of a sudden you find these fossils, and then you start with the idea, what if these fossils are not just because of a lightning strike on the planet or some remnants of the flood, but rather these were ancient organisms, and these were the fossils left behind. Here too, the only way you could truly explain this was the idea that the Earth was a lot older, billions of years older than the biblical explanation. And then you have Charles Darwin that is thrown into the mix. And what was Charles Darwin's main idea? Evolution. But more, what is central to evolution? Okay, and what is natural selection?
A really long process.
True, but
And a species in
okay, but sometimes here's the irony. Sometimes species don't change for hundreds of millions of years. So, for example, you have a type of the crab you find that pretty much is the same organism going back 300 million years. But natural selection simply says that each organism will invariably produce more offspring than will survive. So therefore, let's say, if you have the deer running in the forest, they have to produce more offspring than will live to old age and death. And why do deer have to produce more offspring than would be necessary if they were just living until they died of natural old age causes? Yeah.
They're being hunted.
Exactly. You have the wolves that want to eat the deers, and you have the wolves and all these other predators. I guess sometimes even large eagles will take the newborn, I guess, of the deer, etc. So therefore, if you know that if you're a deer and there's going to be a lot of the deer that are being lost to predation, if you are to survive as a deer species, what do you have to do?
Run and produce a lot of kids.
Thus, the natural selection is saying, here are these wolves trying to eat us. How do we ensure that you have a species? And it's not unconscious, but if you have deer and one deer runs, let's say, 50 kilometers per hour and the other one runs 40 kilometers per hour versus the wolf, which is the one most likely to run away from the wolf? In natural selection, there's more offspring being born than will necessarily reach their natural death. But also, it presumes that there must be variation within the animals, the individuals, because if there was absolutely zero difference, then there wouldn't be natural selection, because natural selection says there are differences, sometimes minor, sometimes major. So if you have some deer that are slightly faster, that are slightly more likely to run away from the wolves, and slightly more likely to have offspring, over time the natural selection says you'll end up with faster and faster deer. But for the wolves, what do they have to do? If all the wolves rely solely on deer to survive, what do they have to do in terms of natural selection? Exactly. Either get faster or decide, enough of this deer, we'll start eating mice. Natural selection might favor one thing, might favor another. And because the animals, these organisms are living in niches. But why is it that the horseshoe crab has been pretty much the same, unchanged for 300 million years? Yeah?
We haven't had enough pressure on it to change.
Exactly. What was good enough 300 million years ago for its survival is still good enough. In other words, the environment in which it lives hasn't changed. The food that it's eating hasn't changed. The predators haven't changed. So there hasn't been any natural selection to favor any changes in the species. So in this case, the natural selection is maintaining the status quo because that is what works. If ever there were some changes, then perhaps some evolution would happen if all of a sudden you would have the force of natural selection might give certain types of these crabs a crab leg up versus the others. So thus you have almost this perfect storm coming together that will have an impact on the social sciences. So you have geology, the idea of a much older Earth, the idea that there's natural selection, that certain individuals may have a better place to change, and this is how to explain how change occurs over time. But what they did is they applied one mistake when it comes to the misunderstanding of evolution. Because what do we not have in evolution when it comes to trying to classify these different species? Is there such a thing as a more evolved species? Nope, because pretty much every species is as evolved as any other species. If it still is in existence today, it means it is the same product of the same 4 billion plus, give or take, years of evolution as any other species. So there's no up, there's no down. This is something we might want to impose. Rather, it is natural selection simply says what are the forces that will favor certain individuals over others, that will allow them to pass on their characteristics, their traits, down to others. You have this perfect storm. We'll throw out the idea of using the biblical text as the only text source for understanding what is happening is on the earth and in culture. So what you will have with Durkheim, that it's not religion, it's not the spiritual, it's not these metaphysical forces that are shaping culture. You have to look at other ways in which culture is being shaped, and the ways in which cultural facts, these elements of culture are being shaped by other elements of culture, and also the new ideas will emerge. You'll have different forces that will emerge. So in other words, one social fact is a result of a long process of change and can only be understood in relation to other social facts. So here's an idea when it came to Durkheim, and look at how his changed. So What do you know about our dear friend Martin Luther? Yeah?
He started to question like Catholic Church at the time, like some of its rules or kind of how it was presented.
Exactly. And the big thing that he hated was the indulgence. The idea that you could sell an indulgence that would get you out of purgatory or hell if you paid enough. So in other words, this was seen saying, no, I've read the Bible, I've been reading the biblical text, there's nothing in there that would justify or allow us to be able to sell indulgence. He went to a church in what's now Germany, nailed his theses, and the next thing you know, you'll have the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. This was helped along, of course, by the newly developing and perfected printing press that all of a sudden allowed Luther to not only nail his theses to a church, but to print hundreds and thousands of these that could be circulated and read. So he was very much the first bestseller. He was constantly writing stuff, printing stuff, distributing stuff, and this would lead to this change in terms of Reformation change. But Luther wasn't the only one. Eventually you have the others that don't like Luther, and one of the other force was the role of Calvin. And Calvin was originally from France, I guess was more Calvin, eventually became Calvin. And Calvin ended up going to what is now Switzerland, and he put forward his own ideas about the Bible and about how we gain, how we achieve heaven. And part of the Calvinist thought was of predestination. The idea is some of us are the elect. We are the chosen ones who have already been chosen by God to go to heaven, and we are living our lives, but there is the outcome is already known. But then if you know the outcome is already known, if you're a human living on earth, what is it that you want to know most of all?
Are you going to heaven?
Therefore, if you know that's already predetermined whether or not you're going to heaven, you ask yourself, you're going to heaven, what do I need to know then? What are any of the signs or the indices that I'll be going to heaven? And this is where it has cultural factors, because one of the ideas was that if you are successful, it's a sign that God loves you. And if you are successful, very often they'll be seen through the material means. So what you have, Durkheim is saying, is you have in Northern Europe, you have this Protestant Reformation, you have these ideas that if I want to know if I'm going to heaven, then I have to see, am I materially successful? And therefore, if my going to heaven is based on my material success, what shall I do?
Get more material.
Exactly. I wanted material successful. So next thing you know, I start saving money, I start investing money. I put an emphasis on making profits and making capital. And how will this affect the transition away from feudalism? Because if I were a feudal lord, what are some of the things I had to do to win the graces of God? Build churches, host festivals, give money to the church, do good deeds, etc., etc. So you have this feudal society that has a different understanding in the sense of going to heaven is based on, not only based on belief, but also on deeds. So therefore you must do the deeds to gain, I guess, straight entry. But all of a sudden you change this. Now the deeds aren't that good, they're insignificant. Rather, you have to show that you're going to heaven based on your material success, and thus, in order to achieve this material success, we will transform society. We don't need all these church holidays. We don't have to have these deeds. Will be very austere. The focus is on saving money, trying to be upright, to show that we are the elect. And this will see these changes. So in the Protestant thought, you have the Lutherans that exist to this day that was focused on translating the Bible into languages that are part of, in a sense, I guess, the belief that individuals read the Bible on their own. You have the Calvinists, and the Calvinists have their offshoots in the English-speaking world as well. You have, in the case of the Church of Scotland, was heavily influenced by Calvinist thought. So therefore, we see these elements of Calvinism in contemporary Scottish culture and society. But you have in England, you have the Church of England, which was King Henry VIII, will keep the trappings of Catholicism, but I will be the one to decide, not the Pope. So therefore, the break from Catholicism. But you also had these other forms of Protestantism in England, including the Puritans. And how will the Puritans affect North American history?
Can you explain what Puritans is?
The Puritans are the ones who are very austere. They don't even celebrate Christmas. They believe that you must work, you must save, you must not be too frivolous, that your goal is, and it's again this Calvinist idea to show that you are the elect of God, so very much almost quasi, almost theocracy, very strict and making sure that everybody follows the moral imperatives of the society. All of a sudden you'll have these various wars in England, and eventually the Protestants, I guess the Puritans will say, we're not really that liked anymore in England, so what are we going to do? Get on a ship and sail to where? New England. So therefore, you'll have in what is now the northeastern United States, you'll have Puritan thought that will develop, that will impose itself, that will see a cultural transition. So thus, Durkheim was saying, if we look at these countries, we will see that these are the ideal places for capitalism to emerge. Because what does capitalism need? A focus on saving, a focus on investment, the need to create more wealth to show that I am the one who is chosen by God. And therefore, this idea that Durkheim puts forward is that the driving force behind the rise of capitalism was in many ways the transformation, I guess, through the Reformation that put into place these ways of understanding your relationship between you, God, and heaven or hell that had an influence, an impact on economic factors and forces. So thus was looking at saying change occurred. Yes, religion was tied into it, but it wasn't God or religion or anything else that was shaping it, but rather it was the ways in which we understood it, the ways that we shaped the institutions, changed the institutions. Calvin wasn't saying, I shall put forward my Reformation ideas in order for us to have capitalism. So it was simply one of those. It wasn't the expected outcome, but it was one of those unexpected outcomes that grew out of this change, that changed the way that individuals perceive their place in relation to everybody else and the universe based on their religious tradition. So thus, it was trying to say how certain changes brought about unexpected changes that are still affecting us to this day. And from a holistic perspective, if once you have the emergence of capitalism, how will that affect the rest of society? All of a sudden, everything changes. What is your goal of capitalist society? Is to make money, to save money, to show that you have wealth. It'll show, in a sense, it'll set the ways, in a sense, we develop, that we manage our economy. So thus, we'll have the unexpected outcomes that would not have been predicted. So you see, this is Durkheim is again starting to look at how the bigger forces that will push, that will change. Then you will have other writers. So you have Herbert Spencer, E.B. Tyler, and Lewis Henry Morgan put forward an evolutionary school to explain how culture and society changed. And in Canada, you have George Mercer Dawson. So what is the evolutionary thought? This idea is building upon the ideas of Darwin, but adding that change, saying it's not only that we have the evolution, but evolution goes through very set steps, set stages, and there is an up and there is a down and there is a civilized and then there's a savage. So that you have this ranking of this cultural change. So these changes are seen as evolutionary, but we have to understand how this is seen, and it fits into this theory. So what is a theory? So a formal description of some parts of the world that explains how, in terms of cause and effect, that part of the world works. So in other words, it is how do you predict things and how do you explain how things came to be based on the evidence? So with this unilineal cultural evolution, so coming out of, the works of these geologists, the works of Durkheim, coming out of the work of these other scholars that are putting into question the idea that the biblical texts will explain everything, rather you're trying to use this model of unilineal evolution to explain how all of these societies that you're now encountering all over the world came to be. Because if you think of it, when Cortez arrived in what is now Mexico, how did he understand the practices of the indigenous Mexica, aka that were later rebaptized the Aztecs, not to confuse them with Mexico? It was the devil. that practice the seed, they have these ritual blood sacrifices, the mixing of the blood to make the bread. What is that a parody of? What is this seen as mimicking and imitating? Christianity, the idea of eating the blood, drinking the blood of Christ, eating the body of Christ, with, I guess, if you look at the Eucharist, etc. So therefore, the Catholic Spaniards entering to Mexico and seeing this, what was their explanation? It's the work of Satan. Satan was here creating this in order to be a mockery of Christianity, and therefore it was the work of Satan that was at play here. And then they had to ask the question, are these really people? And what, if you look in terms of this period, what is the thing that would define whether you're truly human or not? Do you have a soul? And if you have a soul, it means you can convert to Christianity. If you don't have a soul, what would that mean?
You aren't human.
You aren't human. You're no better than a dog. In other words, you are not fulfilled. So it took a while in this debate, are these people even truly human? Again, it was through the prism of theology, through the prism of Christianity, of religion, trying to explain how do we understand who these individuals are on the other side of the globe in this, this new empire that we are now conquering. But with unilineal cultural evolutionism, you have the anthropologists are realizing, yes, there are differences. And it's also built upon the noticing that there are some similarities. So in other words, you have with Lewis Henry Morgan, he was working with the indigenous population of the American Northeast. He was looking at indigenous cultures and trying to put them into understanding them within this framework. So they would say here there are certain similarities. There are those who live largely by hunting and gathering that don't have very large social structures. You have the states versus you have those that are in between. And what these unilineal cultural evolutionary thinkers will produce is this step ladder. So at the very bottom are the ones that are seen as the most distant from European civilization. So these will be what is referred to as savagery. And they would come up with ways of defining. So even they would split them into almost like we do with the Paleolithic, the upper, the middle, and the lower. They had the lower, the infancy of the human race, only gathering nuts and berries. So that was the low end of savagery. In the middle, hey, you start fishing, you discover fire, you start being better at, the hunting. And finally, the up higher is the invention of the bow and the arrow that allows you now to be much more effective at hunting and gathering. So we see this continued, transition. Then you have the barbarism. This is where you have the invention of pottery, making pots and using these for cooking. Also, you develop the domestication of plants and animals. So all of a sudden you have cattle and you'll have horses and you'll have pigs and everything else. And finally, at the high end, you'll have not only you turn towards metal tools. So that's the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And this is where you reach finally the upper edges of barbarism. And finally, with civilization, this is when you have the emergence of true state societies, built upon things such as alphabets, especially phonetic alphabets, the development of writing systems and developing of these very complex structures. And from the point of view, let's say, of British or American cultural evolutionary beliefs, which society would be at the very top? These are Europe. But even all Europe was seen as somewhat, maybe they're not quite as civilized as we are. So in London, you'd put Victorian England at the very top of the evolutionary scale. And if I were Lewis Henry Morgan, who would I put at the very top? Anglo-white America would be seen as the top on the civilization scale. So you're creating these. And what we have is that when in this evolutionary thought, we came up with different forms of not only dealing with the bigger picture, you come up with very specific ways of showing how this evolution happened. How did we change over time? And often, for example, with political power. Now, we still use these concepts to this day, but the idea was political power, the savage had no political state structures, didn't even have kingdoms, didn't have these very complex political structures. Rather, you have band-like society. So people living together, they don't necessarily have laws, they don't have the same, they'll have other customs, but they're living together in very small-scale societies, maybe 20 to a few hundred people living, but where everybody is equal and there isn't necessarily a very strict authority regime. So that would be the equivalent to where you have under savagery. Under barbarian, then you start seeing perhaps the tribe, in a sense, the idea where all of a sudden you'll have some political structure, you'll have, in a sense, perhaps chiefs, you'll have perhaps war leaders, you'll have different ways as individuals will have more power over the other individuals, and finally you'll have the state. So you have with the civilization first, perhaps you have the cities, city-states, you'll have empires, but eventually you'll come to a fully fledged like a state-to-state level society. Came to religion, same thing. The savagery would be associated with animism. The idea that you have the belief in spirits. There's spirits in trees, there's spirits in water, in fire, etc. Next step up was animism. The idea is that, yes, there's a spirit, but there's like sometimes this mana, this larger spiritual force that kind of envelopes everything. And what do you think is the next step up after this animism? That, thanks to Greeks and the Romans, exactly, polytheism. So that's the next stage up. In a sense, when we start being early civilization, you have polytheism, you have multiple gods, very often anthropomorphic god. And then for the Victorian English cultural evolutionary proponent, what would be the very top after polytheism?
Catholic? Or
What do Catholics and Protestants and the followers of Islam, Judaism, what do they share in common?
the idea of one God?
Exactly, monotheism. So that's, you have polytheism, and then the very top stage would be monotheism, the belief in the one God. So this, again, this very ladder-like approach. When it comes to the economy, same thing. So the first, say with the savages, hunting and gathering food, plants, hunting, etc. You might get better at hunting, you might get better at food production. Eventually you have horticulture, using, in a sense, the hoe to make, I guess, just to plant your seeds, have gardens. Eventually you'll have the plow and monoculture. And after that you have the next stage up, you have industrialization, you'll have tractors, etc. But again, you can see it's always this progression step-like from the less to the more, I guess, in terms of the structure. Fortunately, we don't and definitely shouldn't believe in this, I guess, this unilineal cultural evolutionary thought. But ironically, the one place where it was preserved, in large part because he was influenced by Lewis Henry Morgan, is in the writings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx kept this ladder-like approach. And what the main difference is, he had his feudal, but he refined this, I guess, more this civilized. He had feudalism. Eventually you'll have the bourgeois state. But unlike Tyler and others, he said this, your idea of this monotheistic nation state where you have, in a sense, this capitalist society as the top and the ideal, Marx said, no, that's not the end of evolution. The real end of evolution is what?
Everyone being equal?
Exactly. You have eventually, you'll have the rising up of the proletariat and the establishment of a true communist state. So thus, what Marx, the difference is Marx saying, yes, I believe in the step-like approach, but the idea is that we're not stopping here. The next step that we must go through will be communism. So thus, we are waiting, we still haven't progressed to the final stage of humanity, which will be, we will all live in this global communist society across the planet. But the one thing that he kept, and since the Marxism kept, and this will be debated by Lenin and Stalin and in China and elsewhere, was the idea is it necessary to go through all the steps? Is it necessary to go through a true bourgeois capitalist state in order to reach communism? And the same thing with the, let's say, the hunters and the gatherers and the foragers and the ones reindeer herding. The communists are saying, okay, how do we bring them to communism? How do we make them into proletariat? How do we step through? So there were these debates, and the idea was you can't skip any stages. In order to reach communism, you must have a bourgeois nation state, and therefore we have to find a way to create this stage in order to reach communism. So so what communism, the traditional Marxism kept, was this idea that it was almost a universal law that you must pass through step by step, and you can't skip any of the steps to reach finally the ultimate stage of communism. Elsewhere, evolutionary thought, of course, became very quickly associated with racism and imperialism, because it comes down to this: why are the savage and the civilized? What might be a possible explanation, do you think, in terms of racism?
Can you repeat the question?
So let's say if I'm looking or seeing this world is populated by individuals who are hunter-gatherers versus those who are pastoralists versus those, what might be the explanation from a very racist perspective as to why the Inuit weren't building office towers in the Arctic?
There was the idea that they weren't at the same evolution as like Western here.
Exactly. The idea is that the reason why you have these divisions, that some humans were better than others. So this idea that you have, I guess, this biological determinism, that certain humans simply didn't have the same brain power. They didn't have it within them in order to become truly, in a sense, have their societies progress towards, in a sense, truly civilized society. Now, in, let's say, Germany in the 1930s, sadly, where did that bring us to? What did this lead to?
World War II.
World War II, and who was one of the main individuals behind the start of World War II in Europe? Exactly, Adolf Hitler, and I guess the ideas of the Nazi Party and the idea of Aryanism, because for the Nazis, who were the superior humans?
Blonde people with blue eyes, German.
Exactly, the Aryans. So the idea, in a sense, you have the blonde, blue-eyed Aryans who were the master race. And what was the fear? The idea of pollution. So the idea, in a sense, of the true German blood would be seen as being polluted by Jewish blood or these other societies, and therefore you have these ideas that come into play, that the way that we ensure that we don't get polluted, you end up with World War II because our Greek race needs more space, the Lebensraum, in a sense we need more living space. You'll have, of course, the Holocaust, and the Holocaust target largely those of, in a sense, who are Jews, but also people who were physically disabled, people who were, for example, the Roma, aka the gypsies of Europe, these other populations. So these were also the victims who were also sent to the Holocaust in part of this idea of almost this racial purging to create this, getting rid of those individuals who were seen as genetically inferiors. And also was tied to things such as measuring of skulls, trying to explain are, in a sense, skulls from Africa different from those in Asia, different from those in Europe. What does that mean in terms of their mental cognition? And so thus you lead to this very racist framework of saying we're superior not only because of these geopolitical factors that led to us be able to take on all these resources, because we're at the top because we genetically are superior to those at the bottom. So creating this, and this would lead things such as eugenics, in a sense, in North America and elsewhere. The idea is we have to get rid of these inferior genes. So it's part of this. So this is tied to this cultural evolutionary idea of getting rid of those who are inferior to those who are genetically and superior to all others. But we see, in a sense, how this will shape our society. And ultimately, also when it comes to certain types of imperial expansion, it also leads to this logic of social Darwinism. So in the second half of the 19th century, we have different forms of colonialism and imperialism. So if we look at the United States and in Canada in the 1840s, the 1850s, 1860s, what is happening in these regions? You have settler colonial expansion. So thus you have, and who is expanding out towards the west in these regions? British.
French, Dutch, Spanish.
Exactly. But in the United States especially, you'll have, I guess, the emergence, especially once you have the emergence of the United States and after the Civil War, and even before the Civil War, you have this idea that very waspish on the seaboard that will start expanding westwards. And who will they encounter as they expand?
More indigenous groups.
Exactly. And what is invariably, what is in a sense with this interaction? What are some of the outcomes? Lots of death and destruction. And the ones who are being destroyed were indigenous populations, First Nations populations, Indian population, Métis populations. So very much they're saying, you must sign a treaty, otherwise we'll go to war. So in the United States, treaties were negotiated not necessarily by the central state, but by the army. It was very much a kind of a very imperial expansion, where you have the expansion of this dominant society pushing westwards, occupying the land, taking over the resources, and marginalizing, and very often leading to the death of many indigenous populations in this warfare. So you can think of the Cherokee, their forced march, and it was always being pushed more westwards and westwards until there was nowhere left where they could be pushed. So all of a sudden, when you switch this with these ideas of certain populations are superior in terms of evolution, but also that perhaps maybe the result is a social Darwinism. If they can't, if it is a survival of the fittest in this imperial context, who would be seen as the most fit? America. But more specifically, the colonizers, the settler colonialists saying maybe it's a natural way. So because we are fitter, what happens to those species or those individuals within species that are not fit? Well, they die off. They don't reproduce, they don't have descendants. So we can see perhaps, like I said, the extreme, whether it is in fascist Germany and in Europe, whether it is in the extreme forms of settler colonialism in North America, it's still undergirded by this idea that the evolution leads that certain societies will expand to detriments of those that are seen as less evolved. But this will, of course, have will shape in the sense of the outcome. So you'll have very quickly the resistance to these evolutionary thoughts. A case in North America, one of the leaders will be Franz Boas. Franz Boas is a Jew who left Germany. So you can imagine he was already facing anti-Semitism in Germany. And when he publishes his book, I always get confused between the primitive mind or the savage mind. I think one was written by Boas, the other was written, I guess, by Claude Lévi-Strauss. For Boas, it's the primitive mind. The irony is that even though it's called the primitive mind, in the book he argues that there is no such thing as a primitive mind. All human minds are equal. Yes, some individuals might have certain characteristics as others don't have, but that isn't limited to necessarily certain groups. So therefore, any human population are equally likely to have geniuses as they are to have people who are a bit less than genius. So that's the idea, is that there is no superior, there's no inferior when it comes to human minds. So of course, the Nazis didn't like this idea. This Jew now from Germany living in the United States, you're saying that there's no such thing as inferior minds and superior minds. So what do you think the Germans did with his book in Germany? They burnt it, exactly, because that went counter to everything that they believed in. But Boas will be influenced, however, by the colonialism, the imperialism of his state. Because the expectation was, given the brutality of the westward expansion, whether it is in the United States or eventually in Canada, what was the expected outcome? Sadly, was that eventually the indigenous populations will disappear. Either they'll disappear physically in terms of, in a sense, the individuals being killed and being displaced, but also culturally, that they see, in a sense, through assimilation, forced acculturation, etc., that their cultures will, in a sense, will die off, will disappear, even if the individuals of that society do manage to somehow survive. So therefore, if I am in a continent where I'm quickly seeing cultures disappear, what is my first priority as an anthropologist? Exactly, document everything. So we see in this generation of Boaz and his colleagues and this first generation, the idea is we have to gather as much information as possible before it disappears. So therefore, we will record everything. We'll do the information. We'll go spend times living with these various populations across North America. We'll try to record everything. We'll try to describe their practices, their ritual practices, their life practices, their language, etc., etc. So the idea, in a sense, what Boaz was very much against the evolutionary theory and put forward the idea is that we have not to collect everything. Let's worry about theory later. Let's go. We will go and we record as much as possibly can before, sadly, these populations may disappear and where we'll have nothing left. But in order to explain what we have, I guess, Boaz, this idea, this theory, if you want to call it, historical materialism, which is all societies are the product of their own historical evolution. In other words, the Cree are a product of the evolution of Cree society over time versus the Italian society is a history based involving the Roman Empire, etc. So therefore, we won't try to create these universal laws, creates up, down, inferior, superior, etc. We just want to study them all on their own, and then later on, when we have some time, then we can try to figure out whether there might be these larger overarching laws or theories that can explain everything. So that was the driving force behind American anthropological thought and theory. In Great Britain, however, where was British colonialism occurring?
All over the world.
Exactly, all over the world, in Africa, South Asia, East Asia. But unlike North America, did the British expect that the indigenous populations of Africa would disappear? Nope, nobody expected the Zulu to disappear. If anything, the British wanted more Africans in order to work for the British, to benefit the British. But what was the challenge faced by the British in their colonies in Africa and elsewhere? Diseases. There was a malaria. But more importantly, when you're trying to control a large population, what is your big fear? How to keep them from rising up against you. We'll see in the works structural functionalist thought, what preoccupies the British is how can we make changes without leading to chaos? We want to have the political structure in place where we don't have to have the army in there nonstop all the time, where our colonies with the population that we have now militarily we are controlling, how can we change the political structures in such a way that they won't try to push us out, but they'll do the work of policing themselves? How can we change the economy enough so that they will produce the goods, what's the cotton or what the goods that our industries need in England or in Great Britain, while still being able to feed themselves? So this is, we'll see, the central to the evolution of structural functionalism, where structural functionalism is the idea that everything plays a role. There's a function for different institutions. But the metaphor is the human body. So therefore, what is the role of my heart in my body?
Circulate blood.
Exactly. And why do I need blood to circulate?
Keep going, you just die.
What will kill me?
Lack of oxygen.
Exactly. Two things. Lack of oxygen. So you have to bring oxygen to your cells, which allows your cells to create energy and get rid of all the crap out of my blood, out of my organisms. So CO2. If I have this buildup in CO2 in my blood, what's going to happen?
Essentially suffocate.
Yeah, because you're producing the CO2 will become lactic acid, and buildup of lactic acid is not a good thing. But also you have these other toxins and poisons that are shunted off to the liver, or I guess eventually to the kidneys to get rid of the urea. So in other words, the blood is circulating to bring what I need to my cells, blood, oxygen as well as food, and since the energy that I need in the forms of the chemicals that I need to break down to create energy, and it's bringing what I produce, the CO2 and the other products that are the garbage of my cellular activities have to be brought out to be pushed out of me, whether it is a CO2 from through my lungs or materials, chemicals, they'll be processed in my liver, or it'll be sent out of my body through, I guess, through the kidney. So therefore, so my heart plays that role, whereas the skin plays another role to keep organisms out, water in, etc. So thus, from the structural functionalist perspective, each of these organs and each, like every institution in society, plays a role. The police, the Strauss plays a role, the politics plays a role, the economy plays a role, and it's like they all work together to avoid chaos, to avoid anarchy. So if I'm the British colonialist, and if I'm trying to understand, saying all of these different institutions will play their own role in my society, what is it that I want to do? I want to change them, but not in the same way that if I have a heart attack, well, what are some of my options if my heart gives out completely? As a doctor, surgeon, hopefully some of the options, the most extreme options, I get a heart replacement, or they'll put in more an artificial heart. And why is it that this artificial heart will be able to keep me alive? Because it plays the same function. It'll pump the blood to my lungs, it'll pump the blood away, pump fresh blood in my arteries, will bring back blood, bad blood from the cells to my veins, etc. So in other words, it assumes the same function. It allows me to living that even if it's not my heart, as something else, it can assume to play the same function within me to keep my organism alive. So the structural functionalists are trying to say, in the British colonial structure, are trying to say, I don't want to get rid of the political structure at all. If I destroy the political structure, it'll be like me having a heart attack, is that it will lead to the total collapse of the society. Rather, I want to do the heart replacement, or to put in the stent to make sure to open up my arteries and my heart to keep me alive. In other words, I want to be able to tweak their political structure in a way they'll keep the society from falling into anarchy, but make sure that that political structure that I tweak will make sure that they don't want to get rid of their British colonial overlords. So in other words, is how can we change things in a way that will still maintain the integrity of the organism, aka the society, while changing in such a way that it will produce the things that I want for my own society. So in other words, it's how to change the organism in such a way so I can become somewhat a better parasite in order to get what we need out of them to modify the society, to keep it going, but at the same time to ensure that they produce what I want to produce through my own, my colonial ventures. So again, you see how these very different imperial colonial ventures will shape the difference between American cultural anthropology, that was very much the salvage ethnography, versus the British, which was the push towards trying to understand these societies within. And then I have 4 minutes left to talk about Malinowski. So Malinowski, the one who pioneered participant observation, pioneered the writing of field notes, doing the field work, and he had a different type of functionalism. So Malinowski was trying to explain why people do the things that they do. Things such as, let's say, ritual practice. So let's say if I'm the Trobriand Islands, I'm in these islands surrounded by the ocean, and there are simply these lagoons. If I'm taking my boat out in the lagoon, is this going to be dangerous? Not really. It's relatively shallow. There won't be many waves. There won't be any storms. If I overturn, I fall into the lagoon, odds are I could pretty much swim to shore. However, if I go out to the ocean, there's a much better chance that I will end up in a storm. And if I'm capsized, what's going to happen to me?
More likely to die.
Exactly. And the natural selection will be in the favor of the sharks, not me. So therefore, in terms of religious rituals, where am I likely going to expect more in the way of religious ritual? Before I sail out in the lagoon, or before I sail out into the open ocean? Exactly. But in terms of the functionalists, why will I have all these prayers or rituals or trying to avoid bad things happening before I go out? So what is the purpose of having these rituals before I head out to the open ocean? Yeah.
The hope that you would be safe despite it.
Exactly. Because otherwise, if I'm worried all the time that I'm going to die, that'll make it a very stressful and very difficult journey. So what Malinowski's functionalism was, the idea it's a psychological function. It's a way for me that even though the rituals won't have any change, but it'll make me feel better about it. It'll make me feel like I have a better chance of surviving. So in other words, it gives me, it's almost like a psychological panacea. It's a way for me to deal with the fear that I might die in the open ocean. Therefore, this ritual is playing a psychological function to help me as an individual. So therefore, it plays a role, but it's not to stop the society